welcome to you all to this Open University seminar, How to Beat the Skills Shortage, in which we'll be discussing the findings of the 2022 Business Barometer, which has been undertaken by the Open University in conjunction with the British Chambers of Commerce. My name's Sonia Soda. I'm the Chief Leader Writer and a columnist at The Observer, and I'll be hosting this seminar today. I've written about the skills gap in the UK through the course of my work, looking not just at the impact on the macroeconomy, but also on individual well-being. And I think this is such an important time to be having a conversation about skills. The economic outlook is pretty grim at the moment. That's obviously partly as a result of the Ukraine crisis, the impact that that's had on global energy prices. We're working in a context, I think, where no one really knows how long this crisis is going to go on for and how long the very profound impacts this is going to have on our economy is going to be. But of course, there's also been a longer term conversation that we've been having here in the UK that relates to the long-term structural issue around productivity. If we go back to the 2008 financial crisis, back at that time, politicians, including George Osborne as Shadow Chancellor, he promised that there would be a rebalancing of the British economy in the wake of the financial crisis, which would see Britain move away from growth driven by debt-filled consumer spending towards investment and export-led growth. I don't think that rebalancing has ever quite materialised, and in fact, when you look at productivity growth since 2008, the UK's had the second slowest productivity growth in the G7 in the decade that followed the financial crisis. Now, skills policy obviously has a huge influence on productivity. It's key to improving productivity and growth. It has to be at the heart of that conversation. We've got long-standing skills shortages in the UK that I think have been highlighted very aptly by the 2022 Business Barometer. And I think there are serious issues, which I'm sure we'll get on to discussing, about our approach to adult skills and education in this country. It's often taught, our education system is often described very much as a one-shot education system, and it's very hard to come back and retrain as an adult. So I'm sure we're going to be discussing that as part of our conversation today. We're also having this conversation, it's very hard to get away from, at a time of some quite significant political uncertainty. We've got a new Prime Minister whose growth agenda seems to be very focused on tax cuts over investment in skills or infrastructure. So I think there are some big questions over her new administration and what she might do around adult skills and learning and supporting businesses around skills. So I think this is a really important time to be having this conversation. Thank you again for joining us. We've got an absolutely fantastic panel here for you to discuss the findings of the barometer. We've got Phil Kenmore, who's the Director of Corporate Development and Partnership at the Open University. He's going to be talking us through some of the findings of the barometer. We've got Jane Grattan, who's the Head of People Policy at the British Chambers of Commerce, and she'll be talking to us particularly about how businesses can learn from each other in the role that the Chambers of Commerce and other business organisations play in the skills agenda. And then we're also very lucky to have Etty McCormack with us, who is a learning and performance consultant who works with many businesses, helping them plan around investment in skills. So we'll be getting some really great insights from her as well. So I think without further ado, I think we should start off by asking Phil to tell us a bit more about the Business Barometer and its findings. So Phil, can you maybe start off just by giving us some of the background to the barometer?
Yes, great. Thanks, Sonia. Appreciate it. And very, very happy to be here this morning. So the Business Barometer, the Open University started the Business Barometer 6 years ago. We wanted to be able to give business an annual insight into some of the issues that are going on with workforce and with skills gaps in particular. And we decided to do a regular updated report that we could build on year. So we're now in the 6th year and we're very pleased it's been going so well. Actually, it's been the biggest year so far this year.
Great, thank you so much. And why did you decide to partner with the British Chambers of Commerce this year?
Yeah, well, it was an easy decision this year to partner with the BCC because their access to business is unrivaled. The ability to actually get a very large-scale survey across multi-sector, multi-scale businesses made it an easy decision for us this year. And it's enabled us really to expand the report and the way the report can actually tackle some of the key skills issues.
And I've been lucky enough to have a sneak preview of the report, but lots of people on this call won't have done. So I was wondering if you could take us through a summary of what you found.
Yeah, so sure. So just very, very briefly to start with, I mean, we found that over two-thirds of SMEs are currently facing skills shortages, rising to an astonishing 86% of large organizations. Now, I think that's probably not a great surprise to any of us in some senses, but the scale of that report from businesses that we've been talking to is really, really quite astonishing in terms of the level of skills gaps they're facing at the moment. It's been particularly pronounced in manufacturing and the public and third sector. So they're obviously two types of sectors that are really having some difficulties at the moment around the skills gaps. Um, More than half of organisations, particularly the large organisations, have as a result said they will invest more in training next year, which is a really good thing to see. Slightly less SMEs. I think obviously there'll be some budgetary issues and the economic challenges for SMEs are harder to ride out. So their ability to invest in training is going to be slightly more difficult next year. Um, We've also, of course, seen the trend in remote working begin to build post-pandemic or during the pandemic and post-pandemic. 42% of organisations, again, particularly the large ones, have said that's enabled them to attract a slightly different, slightly more varied workforce in different ways. Obviously, they can attract people to work remotely. SMEs are struggling with that. Only 12% of SMEs thought remote working was helping them, probably because for SMEs it's harder for some of them, for some SMEs, to actually do more remote working and actually to recruit and engage and retain people through remote working. That's something perhaps we'll talk about later on during the webinar. I mean, the other headline I think is just worth pulling out at the beginning is, an astounding, really, 73% of organisations said that the challenges of workload and the skills gaps were having a massive increase on their existing workforce in terms of things like well-being, in terms of their health, but also in terms of productivity and profitability of their businesses. So we can see how that there's a real challenge coming through the whole of the business in terms of workforce and of course the ability for the business to operate successfully from these skills gaps that are being identified through the barometer.
And looking at those figures, and you sort of described it as astonishing, the sort of high proportion of large organisations saying they're facing a skills gap, have they gone up or down in recent years?
Well, those figures have actually increased slightly, so it's certainly an increasing problem. And I think, as you introduced at the beginning, you see some of the challenges we've got at the moment, post-Brexit, post-pandemic, the impacts of the economic crisis in terms of we're entering a recessionary period, the impact of the war in Ukraine. Businesses are really struggling with some of those things, and I think particularly large organisations, those things can impact them quite heavily when they have to recruit and retain large numbers of people to keep their business going.
It's really helpful, thank you. Jane, can you just sort of give me the background as to why the British Chambers of Commerce wanted to partner with Open University on this year?
Yeah, hi. It's a really natural fit for us. Both organisations work across the UK with businesses of all sizes and all sectors. And we're both really about finding solutions for businesses to tackle skill shortages and support businesses to really upskill their workforce. So for us, it was a natural partner.
And how do the findings that we've heard from the report, how does that chime with what you're hearing from businesses on the ground and in other surveys and work that BCC does?
Well, 53 accredited chambers across the UK are talking to 300,000 businesses every day. And we're hearing this from particularly SMEs, but larger firms as well, that they're really finding it difficult to fill job vacancies. And the impact that that is having on just their ability to operate profitably is quite astonishing this year. We know that skill shortages have been an issue for many years and businesses have found ways around it. But we really are at crisis point this year with all the things that we talked about earlier with Brexit and the impact of the pandemic and lots of people leaving the workforce, many older workers, choosing to change the way that they work and leaving the workforce earlier. This has really brought things to a head, and businesses are now saying we really have to do something ourselves to tackle this issue because recruitment isn't the option that it used to be anymore. There's huge competition for skills, it's driving up wage pressures. And as well as the recruitment issues, there are also retention issues as well. So, and as Phil touched on earlier, the impact on staff well-being and morale is really creating this perfect storm in the workplace. And training and development is definitely the solution, and we're seeing that coming through the survey results.
And I thought what Phil said about working from home being very interesting, that contrast between larger organisations and SMEs in terms of the impact that it has on them and how easy, it makes it for them to do their day-to-day business, but also around skills and training. What are businesses kind of telling you in the conversations that you're having with them around post-pandemic working patterns?
Okay, well, we're seeing working from home really being built into the way that businesses are operating now, mainly because there's demand from their workforce. People, have said that they want a more flexible working pattern and commuting pattern. They want to maximise their time and their energy. And lots of businesses are saying, they're seeing real benefits from more flexible working practices. But as with everything, you can't see the business community as one thing. There are different pressures on different sizes of firms, different pressures on different sectors. So for firms where people actually need to be in the workplace, it's an in-person role, it's much more difficult to offer working from home. Having said that, firms are now exploring other options such as you know job sharing and annualized hours and all other sorts of options around flexible working, which goes beyond working from home. So there definitely are barriers for smaller firms in particular when it comes to looking at and deciding on all of the options. But I think firms are coming to realise now that there are many benefits from offering more flexible working practices, and there's definitely demand from their workforce.
And what impact does it have on skills and training? You could sort of see how there would be both positives and negatives to sort of having a more hybrid working culture.
Yeah, so I mean the main issue for businesses and managers is how you make sure the workforce is inclusive and that people who are working remotely have the same access to development and training opportunities as those who are regularly in the workplace. So one thing is to make sure that everybody is included and managers are reaching out to everyone, and it does involve managing teams in different ways. But there's also training for managers and training for people on how to make flexible working and remote working the optimum result for the individual and the workplace. So a bit of training comes in here as well, a bit of best practice around people management, but it's huge opportunities. It's a really exciting time for us now. We've seen this massive shift from the traditional 9 to 5, from everything being done in person, to much more flexible, agile workplace. And we need more flexible and agile tools and services to make that really productive and successful for everybody.
Really interesting insights. Thanks, Jane. Etty, I'm going to turn to you if that's all right. So you've been sort of platforming the report's findings in some of the webinars that you run. What has been the most standout finding for you, and what sort of reaction have you been getting from the businesses that you work with?
Okay, so Sonia, I facilitate webinars for the HR and the learning and development professional community about what it means to be a true business partner to the business. And very often we're reacting and responding to events that effectively are putting us behind the curveball. So by the time we're being asked to do something, it's almost already too late. And the mindset that I'm trying to cultivate with my fellow tribe, as it were, is to be proactive, to be professionally curious and go out and ask these questions. And I found that by reading and analysing valuable research like the Business Barometer, we can reframe many of those reactive conversations and take a much more proactive approach to provide a valuable and holistic service to our clients and stakeholders. So, as a group of people, we tend to think we're already very busy and we're reacting and responding, and we've done that pretty agile during a pandemic, but it almost becomes a way of operating. And in a similar fashion, as we start talking about how we support our businesses, is how can we take a longer term, more proactive approach to some of the challenges that we've all got.
And is that something that stood out from the report?
Well, there were lots of valuable findings, and some of them have already been identified by Phil. So it's difficult to pin down just one particular finding, but something that did stand out for me was that smaller and medium-sized organisations are not always aware of what talent they have got to draw on, where exactly it resides, and what the critical skills are to help achieve their business goals, or they feel that they don't have the means to assess the skills of the and capability of the workforce that they've got. So it becomes difficult, and they get caught up in this bit of a spiral, I believe, when it comes to planning activities. Sometimes hard to break off that reactive mode. So businesses suffer from it in the same way. They respond in the moment when perhaps reading the road could have made the journey a little smoother.
Yeah. And why is a proactive approach so important from your perspective and what you've seen?
Again, lots of different reasons, and a lot of my career has been working with organisations, both large and small, to optimise their talent. The reason why it's important to take a proactive approach, and I think we're all feeling it, is because we're trying to succeed in a hugely complex world with a lot of uncertainty. That's almost an understatement, and continually newly emerging challenges. And when you add to that mix that really what we're trying to do is chase a limited pool of talent and skills, then it becomes a very cutthroat situation, and you get into almost like a bidding war rather than building a workforce for tomorrow, and where there's plenty of action for everybody available. It becomes a competition. So my advice is always to take a step back and give yourself time to think. If someone is about to leave the company, there's this big attrition fuel that's impacting talent concerns. If someone's about to leave the company or they've left, ask yourself the sort of question that goes, do I need to backfill with the same skills? Is this now an opportunity to review the role, or to identify if there's a different way of doing this role? And so rather than having the rem- remote work, and again, it's almost a question of the sort of language that we use. When we're talking about remote, we're conjuring up the image that the person is off the premises. When we're talking about working from home, well, we could spend the next half hour talking about the connotations that invokes. But it's that hybrid approach and equipping managers to manage hybrid teams where you are getting the most and the best out of your talent suddenly becomes quite freeing. So that's the sort of conversation that I try and facilitate with organizations who are kind of going, oh my goodness, where is the next disaster going to come from, and how am I going to cope? And I think we've
Yeah.
all become a bit sort of disaster prone.
Well, absolutely. I think with everything that's going on at the moment, I can imagine some, particularly SMEs, they look at what's going on and they're sort of a bit like, how are we supposed to be planning for the medium term, long term around skills and training when we've got all these short term crises to deal with? What do you kind of say to them when that comes up in conversation?
Again, just taking a step back and looking at what exactly is it that you're trying to achieve, potentially what's getting in the way. And I don't minimize the fact that things like recruitment challenges do take a heavy toll on SMEs. Staff attrition, if you're already running a fairly lean team, losing one more person could tip you over the edge. But then add to that, we've got a cost of living crisis that's biting into budgets. And so breaking it down can be a very helpful way, because otherwise it just feels like it's all huge and overwhelming. When we start breaking it down, we can start looking at What are the things that we have got some control over? What are the things that we have absolutely no control over and can't do anything about? This is good sort of basic leadership 101 stuff. And sometimes we also forget that leaders, however big or small your organisation, are human beings as well. And they have sleepless nights. And they're trying to find a way forward, not just for their business, but for their people as well. So it's almost like deconstructing it and then focusing on what are the priorities.
Etty, could you take us through the advice that you give to organisations when it comes to planning?
First and foremost, I would probably say that capability planning, so thinking about your capability rather than just individual and unique skills. Organisational capability is what drives organisations forward. So when you're planning your capability, it means that you're then addressing the skills that you need in order to realise strategic plans. And so the start point, when we look at the slide, is think about the long-term capability needs. This starts at your business planning stage. So when you're thinking about what new markets or what are the target revenues or what new areas do we want to move into, think about what are the capability needs that will get us there. So it's that forward thinking, and just because we're saying I want to be there, that's a strategy, that's great, you know your destination, but what are the things that will help us to get there? What are the tactics? And so that in turn starts helping you to develop the requirements on what people capabilities we will need. That effectively almost becomes your shopping list, if you will, because a little bit like going to the supermarket, if I turn up at the supermarket and I spend £80 and I didn't need to because I've got a refrigerator full of food already, whereas making a shopping list means that I know exactly what I'm going to go out and buy, would be the closest metaphor that I can think of. Then the other thing, that the next step to think about is, so what is my baseline? What capabilities do I currently have? So it's all very well that we know where we want to be and we know what that looks like. What's my baseline for skills and capability today? And once you've got those two things, you're then able to have some conversations or do some planning around how do I close those gaps? Are some of those gaps mission critical, in which case they're a priority to address? Do I have time to build these skills? Do I have to go out and buy them because I need them short term? Is it even part of our core capability? Can I just go out and buy it when I need it, rather than having it sitting on the bench waiting to be used again? So these are all the sorts of conversations that you can have and can help people start thinking about their talent strategy as well, which goes hand in hand, which is around, well, if we're planning to be somewhere this time next year, how long would it take me to have Fred ready to fit into slot? Or do I then have the capability to think about apprenticeships? Can we build that talent? So that's really what the slide talks to, really. It's a very simple approach, but there's a lot of conversation and a lot of thinking and planning around it.
And what do you see as the benefits of that approach from your experience of working with organisations on this?
There are two key benefits that I see, and they're both the approach that I would advocate as a performance consultant, is that you're taking a systematic approach, which is a methodical approach, rather than the, oh my goodness, I've got to fill all these vacancies and everything needs to be done by Friday. So you're taking a methodical and structured approach to how you tackle it, but it's also systemic. So you're looking at the organisation holistically, not just where the problem or the issue might be occurring. So you're also treating not just the cause, but the effect as well, if you will.
And Jane, if I could bring you in here, thinking particularly how this might apply to, I saw you nodding a lot when Etty was speaking to the sort of approach that she recommends. Um, what can smaller organisations do where they may not have the same amount of time and resource as larger organisations to put into these sorts of processes?
Well, that is the critical thing, that, you know, in a smaller organisation, you don't typically have an HR manager, you don't have a learning and development officer. So the sorts of conversations that were probably going on, you know, in larger organisations aren't happening in smaller organisations. And we know from the research that very few organisations have smaller organisations have any sort of written plan to address their training and development needs. But, you know, in reality, people are the most important part of any business, because it's the people who are going to who are going to increase productivity. It's the people who are going to, you know, excel with the customer service, who've got the ideas and the enthusiasm that are going to make your business great. So really spending some time to think about, what skills do my people have now? Where is my business going in the future? What are my growth plans? What are my aspirations? And how do I bring my people with me? And what does that mean? I'm not going to achieve my business goals unless everybody in my organization is bought into that plan and has the skills and the opportunity to learn and grow with my business. Because we're all in this together in the business. So, you know, as Ali was saying, it's about getting everybody involved, and stepping back and taking time to look at that big picture. And if you don't have the skills in-house to do that, and we know that many firms don't, your local accredited chamber can help you. There's mentoring support there, and we can put you in touch with local professionals that can point you in the right direction, save you time, connect you with people who can provide the training and support, or just that impartial advice that you might need, that external pair of eyes that gives you a different perspective and save you time and money, and really learning from what others have done and what the best practice is around there. So my advice would be, take the time to step back, ask the questions, get some help, and you'll really see that making, you know, really big benefits for your organization.
So really echoing some of those messages.
Can I just add something here, Sonia?
Yeah, of course. Please do, Etty.
Sorry, I didn't mean to jump in, and I think Jane really touched on something important. I mean, she's just clearly endorsed everything that I've said, but the key thing here is it's the approach is scalable. So you can do this with a big organization where you have got a dedicated HR or a talent or an L&D team, but turning to organizations like the BCC can give you that scalability. You don't need a full-time HR person. It kind of touches to the skill that I was just saying. You know, if it's not a core capability, bring it in when you need it. Use an external sounding board to help you.
Really useful. Thanks, Etty. Phil, I want to spend a bit of time talking about the role of training now, which is obviously so key to this agenda. Can you tell us what the Business Barometer revealed about employer attitudes to training?
Yeah, sure. And just to pick up on a point that Etty and Jane just made there as well. I mean, working with really good training providers can also help small and big organizations stand back and do that objectivity piece. And if you get a good training provider, of course, they'll help you think about your specific needs and how they can help, or maybe not help in some cases, but at least they'll do that for them. But the Business Barometer had some really interesting stuff to say about training. And as I mentioned earlier, you know, we know that about half of organizations, big organizations, said they're going to invest more in training next year, which is fantastic news. With the skills challenges we've got, you would expect that. Slightly less than that, 43% of SMEs said they were going to invest. But again, it's a much more challenging environment, as we've already said, for SMEs. And going back to one of the points that Etty made, I think, as well, 90% of large organizations actually undertake a process and said they're undertaking processes where they have a written plan, where they've stood back and had an objective review and audit of their skills gaps and their skills shortages, and they have a written plan to address this for their business, which is absolutely fantastic planning. Of course, they've got the HR teams, they've got the L&D teams that enable them to do that. It's much harder for SMEs. A lot less SMEs have got that type of ability to do a written plan. They need the support of the local chambers. They need the support of experts like Etty and others to actually perhaps come in and help them do that. But it's quite clear that those that have the ability to stand back and do an objective thoughtful process with a written plan, are doing their analysis, doing some benchmarking. People talk about doing benchmarking. They talk about using HR agencies, recruitment agencies, etc. They talk about using their HR teams where they have them, and of course asking their staff to understand their skills shortages and doing a full audit, and then creating a plan for the future. And that's what the barometer shows us, that people are beginning to do that. What's really interesting, of course, is that we know that people who are doing that, the businesses that are doing that, have then the ability to think about the short and the long term. And one of the problems we know comes up is actually short-term fixes. A lot of people focus on the short-term fix, particularly when they've got very challenging economic circumstances like we have now. But of course, it's the longer term addressing of skills gaps that actually will drive growth in the future. And there's a need to sort of look beyond the current economic cycle almost, where they are able to do that. Not everybody is, and actually think about what the next economic cycle of growth is going to look like and what do they need for that at that time. And that's something that actually the barometer shows us people who are standing back and doing the analysis can think about when they need to.
Really helpful, thank you. And recruitment, I think, particularly in a time like this, is often seen as the quickest way to plug a skills gap, but it's not always effective. Can you set out why?
Well, one of the challenges with that, of course, is recruiting for skills that are in short supply is very difficult. So if you happen to have those sorts of skills gaps in digital, in technology, in leadership and management and development, if you have skill shortages that are in short supply, it's really hard to go out and recruit for them, and it's going to cost you a lot of money. Not just the process of recruitment, but of course then the demands for wages and benefits, etc. Because as we know, cost of living is driving all those things up. The truth is that growing your own and actually developing your own workforce, and as Etty and Jane have outlined, finding your talent in your business and then growing that actually is a far more sustainable method of making sure you have the talent you need for the future and the skills you need for the future. It's also cheaper, in truth, in the short and the long run,
Oh,
and
that's
it drives the
interesting. I
ability
think
for us to have
lots of
retention.
people might be a bit surprised at that.
Well, I mean, again, you think about the cost of recruitment these days and also the cost of bringing in new talent when the wage demands are high, when actually the need for increasing wages are high. If you've got talent in your organization, it's highly likely that developing them is going to be less expensive for you than drawing in new talent. But also, as I say, you do have the ability to then actually have much better retention, which saves you the money of actually losing people and then recruiting them back again. So the retention abilities, go up quite significantly.
And what does the evidence say about where the biggest skills gap are in the UK economy at the moment?
Well, some of the evidence that we've gathered actually drives you around areas like we've mentioned about digital and technology, particularly leadership and management. Now, this is not new. These come up all the time, and Jane, I'm sure, there's lots of evidence in the chambers as well. Jane will talk about that. These are not new skills gaps. They've been around. The Business Barometer is 6 years old. We've been saying that those are the skills gaps that come out the top quite often. But what's interesting, of course, is I think the pace of the need for those skills gaps has increased. I think at the beginning, when we began this 6 years ago, we maybe talked about these are the skills gaps and people need to plan for the long term. New types of roles, new types of work. We've had a pandemic. Work has shifted massively. We touched earlier, Etty touched on the nature of jobs, the nature of roles has changed, and the nature of the talent we need to be successful has changed. The underlying skills gaps, digital tech, leadership management, are still there, but are now in a different context. We really need to work together, all of the businesses with their providers and the chambers and experts like Etty need to think about how we create talent pipelines for new types of roles in a context of a new type of working. That's a very challenging environment, particularly if you're in a small SME.
And I think another thing that's challenging is there are a multitude of different sort of training options, a multitude of different providers in the market offering different sorts of qualification, different sorts of training programs. How does a business sort of start to navigate this quite complex web of offerings?
Yeah, that's a great question because it is a very complex. And obviously, I'm sat here talking as a provider. We're a university and we provide a certain type of solution to employers. I think the most important thing is to go out to providers and seek those that want to work in partnership with you. I think those that want to work in partnership to help you understand your skills shortage, your skills gaps, and actually then maybe help you co-design and co-deliver some of those solutions. Those are the partners that are going to be sustainable with you in the longer term. I'd also be very wary of any provider that says they can meet all your gaps. It's highly unlikely. If you're a small SME with very specific niche areas, perhaps yes. But for larger or medium and large organizations, most providers should be honest to say, we can do these things, we can help you partner with others to do some of these other things. And I think you need to look at the whole market. Going back to a point that was made earlier, the most important starting point is really understand objectively what is it that you have in terms of talent in the business, what are the gaps you have in the context of the work you need, and therefore what development you really need for the people you have and also for those you're bringing in. The clarity of that process at the beginning, and you can do that with a good provider, that clarity will help you no end. And then, of course, you'll be more successful in whatever solutions you then implement.
So training for a business purpose as opposed to training to tick a box. Phil, I know your
Oh, exactly, yes.
yeah, I know your background in healthcare and training and development in
Yep.
healthcare, and I just wondered if there were any lessons that you thought were particularly pertinent from the healthcare sector that organisations working in other parts of the economy might be able to learn from.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, my background's in the NHS, and I've worked very closely with the NHS for most of my career. The NHS has some very, very challenging skills gaps, as we all know, and they're very high on the political agenda, always, of course, which makes it, very front and centre in the public eye. And they have some things that they've struggled with, and most people know that. But one of the things they are really good at, and they have been good at in very recent years, is actually making the most of their apprenticeship levy. They've done a really excellent job in terms of making sure their apprenticeship levy is used and targeted where they have big skills gaps. For example, in nursing, and we are a major provider of nursing as it happens in the apprenticeship market. But actually, what they're really good at doing is making sure they're using their levy, they're targeting the skills gaps where they can get most of it, and targeting the roles, such as nursing, where the concept of earning while you're learning and developing your career is actually one that attracts the sorts of people they need and retains them. The other thing they've been good at when they've targeted their apprenticeship levy is actually making sure that their existing staff who could be on a career path to jobs like being fully qualified nurses actually get the opportunity to do that. So they've used it as a retention tool. They're spending their levy, they're tackling their biggest skills gap, and they're drawing their own people who are already committed to the organisation. They live locally, they want to stay local, and they're drawing them through their workforce to fully qualified status. That's actually a really good example of one of the things the NHS is doing well.
Sounds like multiple birds with one stone. And are there any other lessons that you would draw from the OU's own skills development partnerships?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's some of the elements of it where I've touched on retention already. Some people have used the tackling of their skill shortage as a very clear retention tool, but in different ways. So, for example, we do work with Uber, for example, and Uber offer their high-level drivers, the drivers that do a lot of work for them, they offer them benefits as part of their package that include learning with the Open University in our case. So actually, those drivers can access learning for whatever they want to do. So some of the drivers, for example, will take Cisco courses and become trained as network developers or programmers. And that's a retention tool for Uber, for their drivers, and at the same time, their drivers are getting an education that they perhaps haven't had access to before. Other organizations use a similar method, but target that development very clearly at the roles they want people to move into. So, for example, Amazon have a similar approach where their staff are offered benefits, education benefits, and the OU is part of the package that they offer. But actually, those benefits are targeted towards digital and technical roles, for example, where they have a future need. One of the other examples I'd perhaps mention briefly is the ability, and I touched on it earlier, to work with providers who will co-design and co-deliver courses or curriculum with the employer because it suits their specific need. So, for example, the Open University has a partnership with North Yorkshire Police, and we work with them to co-create and co-deliver their apprenticeship and their non-apprenticeship policing qualification. And that's actually something we do very closely together around the practical skills of policing and the academic elements of that go around it, and it blends very closely together. That's a model you're seeing more and more now with lots of different employers, particularly the larger ones that have got a quite relatively niche or relatively specific skills shortages and skills needs.
Jane, is there anything that you'd add from the conversations that you're having at BCC with employers around training and what's working and what isn't in training at the moment?
Yeah, I endorse everything Phil has just said, but I think the other really interesting element to it is that when you look at job advertisements, lots of businesses are now saying with full training and development included. And lots of job seekers are searching for jobs that include training and development. So actually, when you think about training in the context of recruitment and retention difficulties, actually investing in people makes you an employer of choice. Yeah, so it's a real advantage and a competitive advantage for you. If your workforce see that you are prepared to invest in them, and then they are more likely to be engaged in your business. So it's a win-win all round. But yeah, the evidence of the impact that training can have, is that there's so much out there about, the return on investment that you will get, the real bottom line benefits of doing this. The evidence is there. It's just how do we help small firms understand that and really, take the time to make that investment, find out what's going to work for them, find the right providers that they can work with. And more about that later in the conversation, I think, because there's some really exciting developments happening at the local level now.
And Etty, is there anything that you would add to what Phil and Jane have said about training and how organisations should engage with training providers?
Well, at the risk of sounding boring, because all three of us seem to be in violent agreement with all the interactions that we have with our clients and stakeholders, I would perhaps again reframe it slightly, because as a small and medium enterprise, very often you feel, oh my gosh, that's a cost that I can't carry. Bringing in somebody to provide some consultancy and perhaps work up an implementation plan or whatever. And I would kind of ask them to look at it from a different perspective rather than think of it as a cost. And I know that budgets might be very tight. Is think of it as an investment in your future, and be very clear about the outcomes that you want to achieve, because then they become your measures of success and you can then see how that investment paid off. So for the sake of if we look at Jane's BCC example, where they have got that sort of professional pool that they can tap into and put them in touch with organisations, or maybe even the work that I do as an independent, it's very much about what will the value be by making this investment, rather than if I write a check for this amount of money. Think of it more proactively. Again, we're back to thinking proactively and what the end state looks like and how will we know that we've got there.
That brings me on very nicely to the next part of the conversation that I wanted to focus on, which is really about best practice and learning and how businesses can learn from each other, which, Jane, I know is a lot of what you focus on at BCC. So could you just kind of talk us through, first of all, what BCC does in this area that enables kind of organisations to learn from each other?
Okay, so as I mentioned, there's a Chamber of Commerce in every region of the UK. And it's an organisation that brings together businesses of all sizes and all sectors. And it's about sharing best practice, making connections, trading locally, internationally, finding a mentor, finding partners to collaborate with and grow and make new opportunities. So it's a really fertile ground to come and talk to businesses outside of your own, outside of your sector, to find people to benchmark with, to find people to collaborate with. And it's right there on your doorstep with lots of other like-minded organisations that want to learn from you as well. So again, it comes to sort of taking time to step out of what's a really busy day job for everyone and really just invest a bit of time to look at what others are doing, because that can save you time. The other issue that we find with businesses is often when they look to find some training. If you're a small business, you might have a training need for one person every other year, for example. And how do you find the right training? And we know that there's a disconnect. There is a real disconnect between small businesses and the local skills system. So one of the really exciting developments that the British Chambers and local chambers have called on government to introduce is a mechanism that formally puts businesses at the heart of local skills planning. Now, this is amazing, really, really interesting development, because what it means is that we are asking, what are your growth plans and your intentions? What does that mean in terms of people? Let us help you plan that out. And then when we understand what the demand is, not just from your business, but from all businesses in your area, then we can work with local providers and funders to make sure that training is available, rather than it being hit and miss. Yeah, to actually plan for the skills that businesses and the local workforce need now and for the future. So in England, these are called local skills improvement plans, but these skills partnerships, these local skills partnerships exist all over the UK. And the interesting thing is how we get more businesses now engaged with these and really deliver for businesses who are going to invest that time, is how we then deliver real good quality, flexible, agile training that really hits the sweet spot and and helps them develop their workforce and achieve that growth potential that they have. As I say, so it's the first thing I would say is through your local chamber, you can now connect to the mechanism, the skill system locally, and input what your needs are, or you can get help to find out what your needs are, and then be able to articulate those needs and then find someone, a training provider, that really can meet those needs for you. So one of the roles of
I was just going to say, how is that working on the ground so far?
so these are new. These are a new initiative that's been introduced this year, and there are some pilots, some trailblazers that have been run at uh, at various locations in the UK. Chambers have run trailblazers of these local skills improvement plans. In a very short space of time, over 10,000 businesses were involved. And the enthusiasm for businesses coming to the table was really extraordinary, because they're saying to me, can you help me meet this need? How soon am I going to see a difference at the local level? When will this new course be on? If there isn't a course there already, how soon can you put one on to meet my need? So what I would say in terms of getting involved with your local chamber, talking to local providers, making sure that we are ready as a skills system to meet your needs as your business is growing now and in the future is really important.
Well, that sounds like a
And
really
Sonia, just
yeah, sure.
Sonia, sorry, just to add to that, I think it's Jane makes a great point. I think the opportunity for LSIPs as well is if you think about the smaller SMEs around the country, there's an opportunity for that fragmented group of small businesses to come together through the chambers and LSIPs to get their voice heard and to get their needs actually provided in the market for them. So even though they're fragmented and it's very diffuse, they can come together and have a real impact. And I don't think they've had that before, so that's a great opportunity.
Yeah, it does sound like a
Yeah.
very
And not only that, it's not only the voice, but it's actually aggregating the demand. So, there might be lots of other businesses in your area with the same need who are struggling to find provision. But actually, when we pull all those businesses together and we think, lots of firms now need this particular type of digital training, or lots of manufacturers in the area are looking for this type of input. It's having that clear picture, not only having the picture, as Etty was saying, of your local, your individual needs as a business, but the local skills improvement plans will take a helicopter view of the whole area. So it's really, really interesting, exciting time to make sure that we're joining up businesses, providers, skills funders, chambers of commerce, to make sure that businesses are getting what they need, but also young people coming through the system, people who are looking to change career, to upskill, reskill, can actually access that training that they need as well to be in charge of and take control of their own careers.
Well, it does sound like a very positive development, I have to say. In terms of other aspects of the context in which businesses are working, what else does the British Chambers of Commerce want to see more of from the government when it comes to skills and training?
Well, the BCC at the national level brings together the voices of all the businesses across the chambers across the UK. And their needs are very, very similar. It is about flexibility and an agile system. So lots of our businesses absolutely love apprenticeships and they love formal qualifications, but actually they're not always right for every business and every individual on every occasion. So it's having access to shorter modular accredited training that gives an individual, particularly someone who's maybe been out of the education system for some time, gives them an introduction, a short introduction to learning again, that allows them to do their job better, that maybe helps them to get a promotion and progress in their current job and in their current career with their current employer, or moving around in their sector. So it's what we've been calling on government for is to introduce publicly funded, shorter, flexible courses that help businesses to upskill and reskill really, really quickly. We've also asked government to help businesses with the financial difficulties that many of them will be having around the affordability of training. And again, it comes back to this return on investment. So we're looking at maybe how the tax system can support through capital allowances, through the ways that businesses can get a return, a tax return on the investment that they, upfront investment that they make in skills training. So it's all part of the big picture, really. It's knowing what you need, it's being able to access the provision, and then making sure that a provision is affordable, and encouraging firms to look at training and development in the way that they would invest in a piece of plant or machinery.
Yeah, well,
It's still going to be absolutely crucial for your business, and for the tax system to treat that investment people as as legitimate business investment.
Yeah, I think that's a really important comparison to make that sort of drives home that this is all investment, really. Phil and Etty, have you got anything that you would like to chip in on in terms of the sort of policy, or the policy asked from government, what changes government could make to make life easier for businesses? Phil?
I mean, I personally, I would echo what Jane's just said about the support for modular accredited learning. I think there's an opportunity for government to really make sure that people have access to those things and they can get funding and get support for them. It's now possible to do micro credentials at 10 or 15 academic credits that you can potentially stack in the future towards other things. For people that haven't done any formal accredited learning for a long time, if at all, that's a really good way of getting back into it, as Jane says, and actually getting support from their business to actually get that learning and accreditation. Having the government behind that would be fantastic.
Etty, have you got anything to add here?
I guess if I were keeping my holistic hat on, and I know that there's a lot of emphasis on the training and the development aspects, is that, again, managers and leaders as role models and nurturing the workforce. So you may be a great people manager when you had everybody in front of you and on site and everything else, but being equipped and being confident to lead a hybrid team, for example, that's not necessarily a learning thing. It's about helping managers to feel supported to do their role effectively as well. And then the things like the learning or the investments in the training, which are absolutely necessary, are then much more targeted investments of time and money.
Thank you. And just before we sort of move on to sort of sharing all of our concluding thoughts, Jane, I just wanted to check in with you, first of all, what advice and guidance is available for people tuning in from the BCC?
So I think the way to think about it is, if you've got a question or an issue, you're very unlikely to be the only organisation that's got that question or issue. So just ask us, just come to your local Chamber of Commerce and see what help and support is available there. As I mentioned earlier, from having someone who's very experienced in business, who's walked the walk, who's available to be a mentor for you, a confidential mentor for you in whatever aspects of your business that you need support with, to that connectivity to other experts and sources of advice. Do go and ask the Chamber first of all, and we can put you in touch with the right people. It will save you a lot of time, and you will learn from best practice. So I guess that would be the main thing. Ask the question. We can definitely help.
That's great. Thank you, Jane. Well, first of all, I'm going to come to you, the three of you, very shortly to ask you for your top tip for organisations thinking about what to do in this space. But before I do that, and just to give you a bit of time to think about it, I just want to sort of, I guess, share some of my reflections on sort of having taken part in this conversation, which has been super interesting. And I think for me, the first thing is really the thing that I take away is that we so often have this very macro discussion about skills and training and skills gaps at a policy level and in journalism and in politics. And I think sometimes it's easy to forget that it's the aggregate of lots of very granular decisions being made by sometimes very small businesses up and down the country, facing some very serious challenges at the moment. So I think that's a really important takeaway. I think a second takeaway is really for me around the sort of the fact that all organisations need to be thinking about this, whether they're large or small, but that small organisations, sometimes it is just harder to take back a step back from the day to day and do the kind of longer term strategy planning. But I think what Etty spoke about in terms of making sure that being clear why you're doing this and how it plugs into your long-term organisational and business strategy is really important. And then finally, I think a takeaway for me is the importance of the sort of policy climate and what government's doing, sometimes in quite a sort of micro scale. So, what's happening, what support is available in local areas, what can local businesses plug into, but also, for example, the ask around more modular training being on offer that businesses can kind of plug into. I think it really does show the importance of the government getting the national context, the policy context right. Anyway, it's been a fascinating conversation. I'm now going to come to the three of you and ask you to share a tip to help organisations get started on their journey in beating the national skills shortage. So Etty, maybe I can come to you first.
I'm not sure that I could give you an absolute, this is what you must do first, but there was something while Jane was talking and all of the resources that you can tap into through the BCC network. I would also suggest something that sounds almost counterintuitive, and that would be, don't be afraid to speak to your competition, because they're also trying to crack the same nut or solve the same riddle. And you can be an immense support and help to each other, and in fact innovate and move things forward without giving away the family silver. And that definitely does work. So there are lots of things that you can tap into. You can tap into your own resources and reach out and talk to people, even if they're your competition. You can reach out to Jane, you can reach out to the OU. It may seem overwhelming, but take that first step. Have that first conversation, whoever it's with, would be my first piece of advice.
Right, thanks, Etty. Phil?
Yeah, I think great comment there from Etty. That's a really good piece of advice. I would say that we talked earlier about being objective and really understanding your skills gaps and your skills needs. I think that's a really important start. Make sure you've done that before you then go ahead and try and commission stuff or do it, so on and so forth, and do it with others. I think the other thing I would say is that we're entering a recessionary period. We're entering a different difficult economic cycle. There was evidence from the 2008 crisis and what happened after that those that thought about and invested and planned for the post-crisis environment, the new economic cycle of growth, did best afterwards. I would say now is the time, once you've done your objective analysis, is think about and invest in and plan for the growth cycle after this period. And I think those that are able to do that will do very well in the future.
Right. And Jane?
I think my parting shot would be just to reiterate that businesses who do invest in their people become an employer of choice. So the best people want to come and work for you, the best people want to stay and work for you. It's a virtuous cycle. So to look on training and development as a really positive investment, get some help on understanding that return on investment and the difference it is going to make to your bottom line. Understand the skills that you've got now, because to reach your growth aspirations as a business, you need to bring every individual with you. And the more you invest your time and in their careers and their opportunities, the more they will engage and the more the business will
If I
succeed.
can just add one last thing in there, just as a tag on to Jane's comment there, it's that value proposition that when somebody is making a choice, and there are still people out there on the job market who have got choices that they can make, especially if they're the hot skills that people are looking for, that value proposition that says it isn't just the paycheck, it's everything else that goes with it, whether it's investing in your development or your progression or whatever it is, that's normally the clincher.
Great comment and final thought to end on. Thanks, Etty. Well, all that remains to say is a huge thank you to the three of you, to you, Phil, Jane, Etty, for sharing your insights today. I thought it was a really interesting conversation. Thank you to all of our viewers. Thank you for joining us. I hope you picked up some useful tips and it set the cogs turning. I just want to remind you all that you can download the Business Barometer report at the link that should now be shown on your screens. So thank you very much and goodbye.